Welcome to this short webinar on resumes and cover letters brought to you by Career Services at the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire. So we're going to talk about resumes first and then make our way into cover letters. Obviously, if you want to talk further about your resume or cover letter, Career Services is here to help. We offer a wide variety of appointments, meeting any virtual needs, and are happy to help you get started, or if you're needing kind of a final draft, kind of here no matter where you are at in the process. So let's talk about resumes. So essentially a resume is a marketing tool. So it's used to market your skills, accomplishments, experiences, your education, and essentially it's used as a first impression by employers or graduate school or any sort of search committee that you're applying to or using your resume for, and it's kind of that way to ensure or push for an interview. So really important that you're putting in that time and energy into crafting your document, making it stand out, because it really is serving as that first impression for you. It's your chance to tell your story, to highlight why you're a relevant fit for that position, and ultimately kind of demonstrate why you're the best fit. The last point on there that's important to remember is that this is a living document. So what your resume might look like right now might be different in a year, even in a month, and it's really important that you're keeping it up to date to match whatever is kind of current going on in your life. So in an ideal world, you would have kind of your beautiful finalized bow on top resume, but then it's also important to kind of keep this additional document that's a collection of things that you've done. So we're going to talk a lot about the importance of customizing your resume for every single position. You don't want the reader to have to guess why you're a relevant fit. You want to show that. And so sometimes it's helpful to have this kind of reference document to see past experiences that are going to most align with that specific posting. So this doesn't have to be formatted. It's strictly for you. I personally just use a Google Doc, kind of figure out what's going to work best for you. But collecting things like jobs or internships, research opportunity, field experience, shadowing experience, conferences, presentations, coursework, and like projects associated with that coursework. Think like final semester projects or projects that you have to like work in a team on, midterm projects, etc. Classes that you've taken with your education, clubs and organizations, whether you've held a leadership position or not, still good to note. Things like volunteer opportunities, service learning, honors awards, scholarships, all those great things. So not only is it important to make note of like when those things happened, so the dates and what they were, but you also want to be sure you're making note of things like what were responsibilities that you had, what were skills that you used or gained or developed, and then what were big results or accomplishments from these experiences that you had. So once you have that, you kind of have that running list. It's important that you're checking back with it every so often to make sure you're keeping it up to date. So I'm going to talk a lot about obviously having a really relevant resume. So one of the easiest ways to really think about having that relevant resume is through customized section headers. So for example, if you're applying to more of like a research-based position, you should for sure have a research experience section on your resume as kind of neon flashing lights highlighting to the reader, hey, this is what you want to see. So as you're scanning and reading through that job description, really identify like what are they looking for? What are their top qualifications, and how are you being really strategic with the section headers to match that. So I just have some examples of like leadership, customer service, volunteer, but think more specific to your field. What are going to be ways to highlight that relevant experience? It's easier than having kind of that really vague experience section, but draws their attention a little bit better. I'm sure everyone has had those jobs that you're thinking back on and thinking, oh, this doesn't align with what I'm wanting to do moving forward. However, still really important, relevant skills that you gained, and those are transferable skills. So skills that are going to be relevant across different areas. Yes, you might not be working as a cashier forever, but you've gained a lot of really great communication, teamwork, customer service skills that are going to be applicable no matter what you do. And so you want to focus on those transferable skills through the use of accomplishment statements. So essentially accomplishment statements are used to kind of bring those transferable skills to life and start to kind of add description and result focused statements under your different experience sections that you have. And so we'll take a look at a few of those in a little bit, but kind of big picture things to think about because you always want to make your document as relevant as possible. So some resume fundamentals, things to think about. You really want to avoid templates. We say to avoid them for two reasons. Number one, if you're going through all this work of customizing and making your document really relevant, you're really not doing yourself a favor by making it blend in with applicants who have the same template as yours. You want to, stand out, not blend in. The other reason to be sure you're avoiding templates is because they're not as easy to use kind of later down the road. Yes, it might be easy to use them initially while you're plugging the information in, but as soon as you need to tweak things or edit things, they're not as user-friendly. When it comes to length, 1 page is ideal. You can use 2 pages, but you always want to ask yourself, is this relevant, or am I just filling space to fill space? And if you're using that second page, you want to be sure it's filled. You don't want to have a first or a second page with just a few lines. If that's the case, really kind of focus on your formatting to think, how can you bring those lines onto that first page? Consistency is one of the most important things with resumes. Yes, you want to have fantastic content, but you want it to be a visually appealing document where someone actually wants to read it. So being really mindful of consistency with the font size, the text, or like the font style that you're using. You don't want to have like an obscene amount of variety with that. Maybe you have your headers in one font style and then your content in another. That's plenty. You want your spacing to be consistent and even throughout, and you really want to avoid large blocks of white space. So be sure you're thinking about moving your resume across the page and not just moving things down to the next line. You don't want to have, a really left content heavy resume. You want to be sure you're filling up that right side too. There's a few different ways that you can go about creating a resume. However, reverse chronological order is the most common, and with that you're listing the most recent experience first within each category. So for example, under a teaching experience section, you would have your most recent or your current position listed first. And I know in school we're constantly taught how to write complete sentences. However, when it comes to resumes, you're actually going to avoid possessive pronouns and write in phrases versus a complete sentence. So instead of saying, I collaborated with the team to do X, Y, and Z, you're going to drop that I and you're going to start with a verb. So you're always going to start with that action verb, and it's important that you're adding variety with that action verb. You don't want to use the same verb over and over or multiple times in your resume. So kind of something to think about there, but drop that I, start with collaborate, and then go into what you did and the result or purpose of the thing that you were doing. Let's take a look at some samples. So you do want to start your resume with a header. Your name should be the largest thing on your resume and should kind of start off that header for you. So we recommend anywhere between an 18 to 23 point font. So after your name, you do want to be sure you're including things like contact information, so an email and a phone number. With that email, you want to be sure it's something that is easily identifiable as you. So for example, if you're using like a personal Gmail, making sure it's like closely related to your name so that the employer can recognize that it's you. Also wanting to be sure that if you're using an Eau Claire email, you're switching that over to a personal email. Later, once you kind of are applying for full-time jobs, you eventually lose that Eau Claire email, so you just want to be sure that you're not using it too long where you're kind of losing that communication potentially with an employer. You can include things like address or a LinkedIn or like a personal website, or if you have a website of field notes or something along those lines that you're wanting to highlight, you can absolutely put that into the header. Otherwise, addresses are totally up to you. Sometimes it's helpful if you're applying for a job kind of like back home, say you're from the Madison area originally, it's helpful for an employer to see like, oh, you have that address, it makes sense that you're applying for jobs around here. But if you're looking to relocate or kind of applying in various areas, you might just want to omit that information altogether to kind of indicate that flexibility. So the next kind of like official first section that I recommend including is your education. Obviously this can kind of change as you go throughout your career, but you want to be sure to list your education first because it's the most relevant. So things to have within education, having university, the institution, location. So University of Wisconsin, Eau Claire, Wisconsin. I know that seems a bit repetitive, but it's needed because of the formality of it. And if you think of institutions, for example, like UW Stout. Stout's not a city, it's in Menominee, so you do want to include both of those. You then want to be sure you're including your actual bachelor's degree, so Bachelor of Science, Bachelor of Arts, Bachelor of Business Administration, Bachelor of Social Work, what have you, and then including things like your major, any sort of minor, certificates, etc. And then no need to put like a full duration that you've attended or you are going to attend. Employers are just wanting to see that expected graduation date. So you can put anticipated, expected graduation, and then month and year. You'll notice things like study abroad, or maybe you're wanting to include some relevant coursework or a GPA. All great options too, but definitely not needed if you decide to not include that information. So experience sections are kind of what come next. You want to really evaluate what's going to be the most relevant for whatever you're applying to, and then that should be your next section. So this is where you can kind of pick and choose those customized section headers. No matter what sections you decide to include, you want to be sure you're including a position title, the organization name, location, which is just city and state, and then dates. Really important to be mindful of how you're formatting those dates. So if you're abbreviating dates, great. You should just be abbreviating them throughout your whole document. Maybe you want to use the numeric value. That's also fine. But again, keep that consistency. Your experience sections are also where you're going to start to bring in those bulleted statements that are highlighting those accomplishments. So highlighting those transferable skills that you gained, the results or accomplishments, and really thinking about like the specifics of those. So let's take a look at some samples. You can see I have a research experience section, as well as a other work experience. You have that kind of necessary for items of information, title, organization, location, dates, and then you have those bulleted statements. So they all start with a different verb. One thing to note, if it's a position that's in the past, those verbs are going to be in past tense. If it's in the present or it's a current position, you're going to use present tense. So action verb, and then you kind of want to move into like what you were doing. So for example, we'll look under the other work experience under the cook position. So you work as a team. So action verb, what they were doing. And then you want to focus on the why. So to ensure customer satisfaction and smooth operation of the business. So action verb plus what you were doing plus why, that purpose, that result. The other thing you do want to think about is getting specifics. So thinking about how you can add scope, whether it's by quantifying, by adding percentages, or the number of something, or the number of people, or a certain budget, or just getting into the specifics by naming processes, naming technology used, naming certain softwares, like those types of things, are really going to paint a picture for the employer to understand fully what you are doing. So yes, you want them to be short, but you also want them to paint a picture for what you're doing, and you don't want to have any statements that could be somewhat subjective. So these are just some additional samples you could consider. Maybe an awards section. I've seen things like lab skills, technical skills, field skills, language skills. You want to be sure to avoid a skills section that has more broad essential skills, such as like communication or teamwork. It's better to talk about those within your accomplishment statements or those bullet points versus listing them in here. So the reason I bring this up is mainly to just see the different kinds of formatting. On Handshake, we do have a resume and cover letter guide that does go into more depth on different types of headers. It does have a sample resume in that packet, but we also have dozens of other sample resumes to take a look at within Handshake under our resources. So feel free to take a look at those to get some inspiration of how you want to format that. I also just wanted to point out that you don't have to have accomplishment statements under everything on your document. However, that's not a free pass to not include any. But for example, maybe you have an internship experience section and a leadership experience section where you're going into more depth on those things, but then your volunteer experience, you just simply list items such as the member and involvement example on the slide. So if you don't have relevant experience, or you think you don't have relevant experience, remember that experience does not only mean paid experience. It's totally fine to have something such as relevant coursework where you're actually starting to give some accomplishment statements to a specific course and talk about the projects and skills that you were gaining. You could also think about things like select projects. Maybe you have like a side hustle, or you're doing work kind of outside of the classroom, but you're not necessarily getting like paid for it in a job, but you're still building those relevant experiences. There's definitely ways to get those types of things on your resume and highlight that really relevant skills and experiences that you have. So think about outside of work, how are you building that relevant experience? And just remember that everyone has to start somewhere. So something to think about. So let's transition over to cover letters. So I have cover letters question mark because I oftentimes get asked, like, what's the point of a cover letter? And essentially the point of it is to help introduce yourself to an organization in more of a story form. So obviously your resume is very structured, it's very formatted. You have kind of those accomplishment statements that paint a picture for your results, your skills, and should really answer that question of like, could you do the job? Do you have the skills? And your cover letter really starts to address, are you going to be a good fit? So you're able to tell a lot more about why you're interested in that specific organization and really draw attention to yourself as a fit for the position and really, again, motivate that reader to want to interview you. So really your a cover letter is broken down into kind of some formatted different parts as if it were, a letter being mailed off and sent. So with that being said, you want to have your contact information up at the top, so you can put like name and address. However, we just talked about with resumes how an address isn't a necessity. You could think about bringing over that header that you had on your resume over to your cover letter and using that here instead of that name and address format. So either is accepted. You then want to have some space and then a date. So the date you're writing it, the date you're submitting it, and then again, those 2 lines of space. And then you're wanting to address the employer. So if there is a given name, great. If there's not, you don't want to guess. You don't want to assume. It's okay to just have the organization's name and their address and kind of leave out the specifics of who it's actually going to. And then below that, you want to have a formal greeting. So dear, if there is a given name, you can include that here. If they, again, don't give you that name, I really recommend using something like Dear Hiring Manager, Dear Hiring Team. You could say Dear Main Street Corporation, Dear Selection Committee. You want to kind of make it as tailored as you can. You want to avoid really vague things such as Dear Whom It May Concern. So something to think about. And then you want to be sure you're using a colon and not a comma, and that's just because it's a formal document, right? If you're writing a letter to a family member or a friend, you would usually say like, Dear Amanda, comma. But because this is a formal document for a job, you're going to use a colon. So then it's really broken down into your introduction, your body, your conclusion. Your introduction is really, really important, and I think oftentimes people try to make the introduction almost like a template for all of their cover letters, and it's really important that this section in particular is the most customized. So yes, it should, address the position you're applying to, giving the official job title, but ultimately you want to use your introduction to answer why are you applying for this position or this organization. Essentially, what made you say yes to this position over the next one that you saw. So maybe you have some sort of connection, maybe you met with them at an event, maybe you are just really excited about their goals and mission, or you love their service and products, or this is the dream company. No matter what that connection point is, that's what you should be addressing in your cover letter. So really kind of demonstrating that enthusiasm, showing that passion of, I'm excited to apply because blank. Yes, you should, obviously kind of like introduce the position and having your kind of generic, please accept my application for this position, but you want to use those few sentences in your introduction to really make that hook for the reader to want to keep reading. So then your body is where you start to think about like what makes you shine, like what makes you stand out as the best fit for this position. It is not a place to retell what's on your resume. Instead, you want to think about going beyond what's on your resume. So maybe instead in your body paragraph or paragraphs, you can have, more than one. You're highlighting one or two things versus, the 7 things that are on your resume. And you really want to think about how does your experience align with that job description, using similar language to tell your story and talk about your accomplishments, but you also want to think about what's in it for the employer, right? What are they going to get out of you being in this position? You don't want your cover letter to be focused on you, what you gain, and all of your accomplishments. You really want to make that connection of, okay, I said I did this experience, I've gained these skills. How is that relevant to them? So your conclusion is your final push for the interview. This one's usually the easiest to write. It's usually a pretty short paragraph of thanking them for their time and consideration, kind of including your contact information and that they can reach out if they have any questions or would like to schedule an interview. Again, really showing that enthusiasm, being really excited about the organization and how you're a great fit. And then you're going to end with your final closing of having some sort of polite sign-off, a signature. You can add a digital signature, insert an image of your signature, and then you're going to have your name right below that. And then you're going to include attachment if you're sending it electronically, such as email or uploading it to an online job application, or if you're handing this to someone, you're going to put enclosure, and then you're going to indicate like what else you're submitting with it. So if the job application asks for a resume and cover letter, you would say attachment resume, or maybe they're looking for a resume and transcripts or a sample of your work. You would include those things then in parentheses after saying attachment or enclosure. So very kind of formatted, there's a flow with cover letters, but it's really important to remember that you're limited to 1 page. So when you're writing those body paragraphs, yes, you can have more than one, but you really want to be mindful of space. Obviously, you have that kind of initial formatting that goes into it. You really want to have that hook. You don't want to cut yourself short of that hook. So making sure you're still being really clear and concise throughout your cover letter to make sure that you're not going over that 1 page limit. Personalize each letter. However, save all of your cover letters. Don't reinvent the wheel every single time, but you always want to customize it to the employer that you're applying to. You want to avoid overusing I. It can become really easy, especially in those body paragraphs or paragraph, to start every sentence with I. I've done this experience, I've gained these skills, I can contribute this. So really thinking about how can you use action verbs as kind of a replacement to potentially restructure those sentences so that it doesn't seem so focused on you, but instead focused on the employer and the skills that you have. You want to be mindful of using confident language. An employer doesn't want to read a cover letter where an applicant says they think they're good at something, right? An employer wants to hire someone who's confident and competent and ready to kind of take the job and is willing to accept any learning curve. So make sure you're using that confident language, have confidence in your abilities and skills, and let that shine through. And then finally, proofread. Obviously a little biased, but utilize career services. We're happy to help with that first review, that 5th review, whatever you need to help you feel comfortable and confident to have the best application you can. So that's all that I have. If you have questions or if you'd like to schedule a appointment, we offer a variety of virtual appointments. So feel free to reach out. We're happy to meet with you to chat through your resume and cover letter. And you can do that by logging on into Handshake with your UW Eau Claire account. and then heading over to Career Center, and then you're going to see appointments right away, being able to schedule that. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Otherwise, I hope this was helpful in getting you started with your resume and cover letter.